while the concept of information does not belong exclusively to the world of library information science, documentation studies, at least historically, is uniquely related to the discipline, but at the same time provides interdisciplinary or transversal approaches, because it extends the scope of understanding what information is, and can be applied in 4 different disciplines. I've certainly seen that in my own research, looking at, for example, identity constructions, the role that documentation plays in constructing identity. Niels Lund states that while it remains an important part of the discipline of library information science, the very diversity of the projects nevertheless demonstrates that the field of documentation may not be defined as a specific empirical field, but rather by taking a special perspective upon the world, viewing human life from a documentation perspective. So there must be an awareness of the complexity of documentation, and that a document can never be completely isolated and considered to be essentially about one specific issue. Instead, the document must be viewed within a certain environment and how it has turned into a document to be analyzed, to be used. Documentation's complexity and diversity not only demand a diverse application, but also simultaneously expands ideas, or at least I argue, expands our areas of research and even the possibilities of information, of what information is. Fourth, analyzing practices. Analyzing the practices associated with documents illuminates or sheds light on how it is that documents are researched, how they're consulted, and how they're used first and foremost, before any analyses of their information. So research, when we conduct research, for instance, it necessarily involves searching for, accessing, and retrieving documents. So is everything that one retrieves or seeks or searches for, is it information? Well, no. I argue it's more helpful to reorient our focus from information retrieval to documentation or documentation retrieval, because what is of interest when it comes to retrieval, first and foremost, is the retrieval of documents. Virgil Hjorlund explains that document retrieval, text retrieval, content retrieval are often used as synonyms for information retrieval, which he says is very embarrassing that these kinds of elementary misunderstandings are so widespread. To prevent this proliferation of misunderstandings, the privileging of information arguably should cease and instead should focus to documentation. Okay, great. So if we can distinguish information from documentation, and also there are differences that show their relations in those ways, how then can we approach bibliodiversity from a documentary perspective, or using some documentary analysis? I argue that a documentary approach not only helps illuminate the centrality of documentation for bibliodiversity, but incidentally provides a materialist perspective and analyses for expanded explorations of bibliodiversity. So this kind of approach does not aim to introduce a new phenomenon to bibliodiversity, but instead to present another important way of understanding it. So again, back to Niels Lund, for example, he explains that such an approach, a documentary approach, is not supposed to provide a framework for a new kind of object, not dealt with in other disciplines. Instead, it is more of a framework for making an analysis of the same empirical field, but from a different perspective, and thus actually not focusing on the exact same objects. So while the term document is not new, a documentary approach or a methodology provides a fresh way in which to view documents and information. Elsewhere, I've developed what I call a material documentary literacy framework to help one engage in such an approach. And this approach, this material documentary framework, involves placing a specific document or documents at the center of observation, study, and analysis, and thereby develop documentary dialogues about and for it, and then use the document to better illuminate its wider context, and then integrate that document in teaching and researching and managing information. So again, using this framework, documentation is foregrounded in this analysis. Its materiality is illuminated, and it examines not just the materials of the objects. It identifies each object as a kind of document. It studies each one's associated practices, including writing, production, publication uses. And it explores what actors, both human and increasingly non-human, as well as institutions, infrastructures, and systems are involved. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, such an approach examines the affordances and effects of these documents. So that is what information that they materialize, present, and make possible, what message or messages they enable, what ideas they construct or deconstruct, and what possibilities they illuminate or darken, and what opportunities they allow or forbid. I have about 5 minutes. 4 minutes? Okay, even less. So I'll breeze through this. I could turn this into one of my 3-hour graduate seminars on documentation theory, which I'm sure everyone would be thrilled with. Similarly, Michael Buckland says that there are 4 main aspects of documentary methodology. And I'll very briefly go through them. These 4 aspects involve human agency, the materials and the technologies, techniques and practices, and effects, purposes, and outcomes. The first aspect, human agency, examines who created the document. So he observes how most documents are social productions, not the work of individuals. A wide variety of people are involved in differing ways. So he notes that documents commonly have a series of lives, with different players involved in differing ways at successive stages. So Don Brennies, for example, describes documents as having histories and careers. He observes how documents, for example, he looks at institutional documents, are embedded in multiple histories at every institutional level. So these multiple histories affect and shape the forms, formats, structure, and uses of these documents. And these histories, moreover, are intimately connected with the careers of these documents. Brenny states that in order to understand the changes it goes through in its histories, it's crucial to locate the forms in the specific annual administrative processes within which they figure. That is, to follow their careers, the doings with documents in which they are routinely involved, and to trace the subsequent events in which they take particular kinds of life. The second and third aspects of a documentary methodology examine what materials and technologies are involved in the creation of documents and their practices. So Buckland asks what technologies were used, what resources exploited, what are the effects of innovation in the materials and the technologies selected. He also asks what techniques were used, how were the technologies deployed, etc. The materials involved and used shape the object and determine the practices afforded by and with it. So again, to use that example that I used a bit earlier, a clay tablet involves different materials and affords different practices than a digital tablet. The fourth aspect of a documentary methodology examines the effects of documentation. So Buckland argues that the central question is, what does a document document has several aspects? What was the purpose? What is revealed, often unintentionally, about the creators? More generally, how do different forms of document compare in different situations, especially in their effectiveness for different purposes? And one thing I've been arguing throughout this presentation, one important effect of documentation is the materialization of information. Bert Froman argues that attention to documents and practices with them reveals how it is that particular documents at particular times and places and in particular areas of the social, cultural terrain become informative. So documents and our practices with them are necessary for materializing information and consequently to making the document's content, its stories, its information informative. And I'm making a conclusion. Of course. Ultimately, I argue that a documentary perspective can begin to show how one can conceptually approach bibliodiversity to more fully illuminate or understand the centrality of its documentation and the diversity of its documentation. Again, its documents and its practices. The ultimate objective is placing documents instead of information at the center of study or focus by analyzing their materiality, their practices, and their effects to better illuminate their significance in and for different contexts. So an orientation towards documentation emphasizes the central role, place, and materiality of information in diverse settings, institutions, relationships, instead of some abstract ideal information understood as knowledge or content of mind. Documentation studies, more broadly I argue, helps account, therefore, not only for the material considerations of information, but also, importantly, expands areas of research and possibilities of and for information. So again, ultimately, a focus on documentation helps draw attention back to the important roles that documents and their practices play in the study and examination of bibliodiversity. Thank you.